Hello there. So here's an example, and there is some relevance to it, at least to parts of it, to the setup. There's some relevance to one of the homework problems this week. If you're struggling or you want to think through how to go about certain calculations using Bayes' theorem in the odds form, if you'd like, you can do it in a number of different ways, as I've pointed out. So suppose over the course of a long murder trial, some damning evidence has just piled up, a bunch of bits of evidence, and things are really pushing against the defendant. That is, they're looking more and more like the defendant did in fact commit the murder. They're accused of killing his ex-wife and her boyfriend, so that a reasonable juror might consider probability of guilt to be 0.98. This is somewhat arbitrary. Don't take as with any priors. Well, it's sort of an initial prior is purely subjective, but we can consider a range of plausible options and certain ones which are out of the question. But as I pointed out already, if there's a lot of evidence, it turns out that wherever you start within a reasonable range, you'd wind up after seeing all of this evidence somewhere around the same place as, say, fellow jurors. So that just to sort of characterize it in some way, although necessarily somewhat arbitrary, I'd argue that giving some characterization of uncertainty is helpful, is better than just sort of hiding it or pretending it doesn't exist. So let's just, for the sake of argument, assume 0.98 prior probability at this point in the trial after lots of damning evidence. And a final piece of evidence, a glove very likely worn by the murderer, is found near the crime scene. If you are a history buff, this will make you think, or if you watch true crime series, this will make you think of an actual trial that was got huge attention during the early to mid 90s, or 93, 94, 95 or so. If not, that's fine. Probably for the best. So this glove is found, and the defense attorney treating this evidence in his favor, and it is in his favor because it turns out the glove doesn't seem to fit the murderer, but he treats it as if this was deterministic rather than probabilistic, rather than perhaps a strong bit of evidence, perhaps maybe less than he's claiming. But he implies with his words that jurors can now essentially safely ignore all previous evidence, as if this is sort of the nail in the, or this is proof one that the defendant is not guilty. So he says in a famous line, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. He says this, I think, the first time before even, well, this is a make-believe example, let's say, but sure enough, when the defendant does, when the accused does put on the glove, he kind of goes, I can't fit it. So there you go. There's the evidence. So let's leave aside other plausible explanations, like the glove doesn't belong to the killer and it just happened to be there. There was probably blood from the murder on it, but maybe it just happened to drip on a glove that was already there. There's various plausible explanations that include the defendant actually being guilty and the glove just not being theirs or not being connected to the crime. So that is to say, it could be a red herring, as we've called it before. But let's assume that the glove is indeed the killer's, whoever that killer may be, and is determined to be of such a size that it fits 75% of adult hands, a kind of, all except for extremely larger hands above the third quartile. So the evidence, what's the evidence? Well, the defendant attempts, I put that in quotes because it was not like a scientific examination. This is more like a Cinderella attempt from Cinderella's sisters trying to squeeze themselves into the glass slipper. But in this case, he's actually, obviously has an interest in it not fitting. So he's not going to push it in too far and say, I guess it could fit. It's just a bit snug. He starts to put it on and says, oh, I can't do it. Oh, well. So appears to be too small. leading, of course, the defense attorney to say, well, you got to acquit, can't be him, glove didn't fit. So is the probability of this evidence, were the defendant actually guilty, equal to 0? Obviously, I'm arguing no. Very little by way of sort of likelihoods. We talked about the fact that virtually no evidence is ideal in the sense that it seals, that it makes 100% clear one side or the other is correct. So let's just recall for a moment in the odds form of Bayes' theorem that posterior odds is equal to prior odds times likelihood ratio. And let's figure out how we can set this up in a reasonable way here. So the prior odds, well, we said we're starting from what's given, that assuming a reasonable prior probability is 0.98. I will again point out it's natural to do a sort of sensitivity analysis at the end to say, well, what are some other reasonable, would it be reasonable, let's say, for a juror with all the evidence considered so far to still be 50-50? We might say that in fact it was, that there was a lot of good evidence on both sides and a person could very much be on the fence. We might say it's less likely, given all the evidence that came before, that the prior odds of a reasonable juror would be, let's say, 10% of guilt, right? That there was just way too much damning evidence against the accused murderer, the defendant, to, unless you were ignoring that evidence to say, oh, at this point in the trial, I'm ready to pretty much acquit, right? Now, of course, we're leaving aside for the moment how we should think about reasonable doubt in a murder trial. And so it may be that we say, look, anything under 95% posterior probability of guilt, and we should give them the benefit of reasonable doubt and drop, and not convict. But I'll leave that aside. And we'll talk a little bit later toward the end of the semester, maybe about that sort of burden of proof. So prior odds, well, in probability sense, it's 98% or 0.98. Remember that odds are probability divided by 1 minus the probability, right? It's putting a ratio instead of the probability of the event over the total. It's putting the probability of the event over the probability that the event does not occur. So in this case, probability of hypothesis divided by probability of the complement of the hypothesis, probability of guilt divided by probability of innocence, right? So 49-1, or just a 49 as the odds ratio here. The prior odds ratio. What about the likelihood ratio? Well, let's recall what likelihoods are, right? They're probability, in legal sense, probability of evidence that's actually found under different potential hypotheses. For us, we're just considering 2. So in the numerator, it's the probability of this evidence given the hypothesis of guilt divided by the probability of this evidence, the glove not fitting, given, if it were the case that the accused was not guilty, right? That it was someone else that committed the murder. So that ratio is giving us a sense, if it's bigger than 1, it's telling us how many times more likely the evidence would be in the case that the accused was guilty rather than not guilty. If it's less than 1, it's a say it was a half, it would say 1 to 2 odds. It would say it was twice as the evidence is twice as likely in the case of the accused not being guilty, right? So it's being put into a single number that gives you a sense of how much more or less likely the evidence would be under competing hypotheses. So probability glove doesn't fit given guilty divided by probability glove doesn't fit. Notice that the evidence is not changing, right? So we're not considering the probability that the glove does fit, right? We actually have the evidence. We don't need to think about here. We're not considering what evidence that we didn't see would have told us. We're only interested in what the evidence we do see tells us and how much more or less likely it is under competing hypotheses. So the defense attorney saying if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, is essentially saying hey, jury, the numerator is now 0. It doesn't really even matter what the denominator is, right? And we see cases, and actually the case in your homework, one of them is like this, where the assumption is, in fact, we're dealing with a situation where where maybe the evidence is in favor of the prosecutor. And here it's in favor of the defense, but it's not 0. And so what's an appropriate number to put in the numerator then? Here too, as with the prior, we're not going to be super precise. There's no precise way to estimate what the probability is that the glove strangely doesn't fit despite the accused being guilty. But it's not 0. As I said, it could be a red herring. Maybe the glove's not the murderer's. They found a small glove. There was a drip of blood on it, or there was some other reason to treat it as if it was the murderer's, and they recognized it was really small, and they could use it to exonerate. But even if it is the murderer's, which we're going to assume here, why is it not the case that the probability of it not fitting, hey, if it doesn't fit, if they were guilty and if this was their glove, how would it be possible for it not to fit? I mean, if they were wearing it at the murder, you can think about that for a moment. I'm sure you can come up with a number of reasons not to have it be 100% or 0%. I will give you one plausible explanation, and I think it might have actually, in the case that I'm thinking of, might have come up and been discussed. But it was leather. Leather shrinks with moisture and lack of use. Well, it was left out overnight. There's dew. I don't know if it potentially rained. Probably not. In this case is in California, but it was left to the elements for some period of time. And now it's been a long time since it was collected and put into evidence. And so even without anything else, it's probably shrunk a bit. Also, as I said, this is not a scientific test. We didn't put some forensic expert in with them who could force it on and say, oh, no, it's just a little snug. You're exaggerating, right? It was just theatrics of the defendant struggling that was supposed to stick with the jury. So let's put a number on it and assume, the fact that it doesn't seem to fit. We could say, let's just disregard that, and that it's not, either judge could insist on this and say there's no probative value, this is irrelevant. But it's a juror can also decide, doesn't sway me in one direction or the other. I just don't buy this as important evidence. But let's grant a little bit of the benefit of the doubt to the defense attorney and suppose that the probability of the glove not fitting, if in fact the defendant is guilty, is small, but not super small, but let's say 15%, right? There's some 15% chance that due to shrinking, the fact that it was kind of snug on the murderer anyway to begin with, and the leaving it in the hands of the accused to sort of faux struggle with it, there's a 15% chance that they can make it look like it's too small, right, despite it actually belonging to them. All right, so let's take that, and again, you could use a different number and see where it gets you to a final result and whether it matters that much. So posterior's prior times likelihood. The likelihood then is the ratio of probability that of the evidence given guilt divided by probability of this evidence it not fitting given innocence. So 15%, where did I get that 75% from? I mentioned earlier, it was a given fact that this glove, at least in our pretend example, can fit 75% of adult hands. So what does that mean, right? That ratio, 15% to 75%, 15 over 75, 1 over 5, right? 1 to 5 odds, right? It is 5 times as likely that we would have gotten a glove that didn't fit in the case where there was some other murderer, right? This is a common size that should fit a lot of people. It didn't seem to fit the accused, right? So this is valuable evidence. It should push us more in the direction against finding the defendant guilty. But it's in addition to a lot of other evidence that has gotten to us to a point, hypothetically, that we were close to convicting, right? So it's not just the likelihood alone, the fact that, and we certainly don't want to do the prosecutor's fallacy, make the fallacy, and fall into that trap and say, oh, there's only a 1 in 5 chance of guilt. Of course, again, the prosecutor wasn't even, and the defense wasn't even saying that. They were saying you must acquit. So they were essentially saying it's 0/5, 0/0.75. Okay, so prior odds were 46-1. That was from the 98% over 2%. So we multiply these two together to get the posterior odds, and we get 46-5. So in a case where we had overwhelming prior odds from previous evidence accumulating, multiplying by likelihood that pushes us in the opposite direction. But in this case, we would still be at a 46-5 posterior odds of guilt. Those are the odds of guilt. But if you want to express them as probability, what do? Well, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, you can solve if odds is equal to probability over 1 minus probability. You can use algebra and solve for probability in terms of odds, and you can always define the probability, take the odds divided by odds plus 1. Even easier than that and more intuitive, although it's essentially the same thing in practice, is we can take the numerator and put it over the numerator plus the denominator, right? Think about why this makes sense. If the odds are 46-5 in favor versus against, well, the favor, so what proportion out of the total chances, if you want to think of it that way, the sort of weighting, there's the 46 in favor, there's the 5 against, so it's a 46 out of the 46 plus 5 1 chances. So loosely, 46 over 46 plus 5 works out to about a 90% posterior probability of guilt. So again, this is, we can start from and ask, well, what should have happened if, let's say, we started with a 50-50 prior, or if we assessed the probability of glove not fitting given the hypothesis was, say, 0.05. In any of those cases, though, although an argument of, it's fair to say, this seems a little bit like it's giving some sort of false precision. It's treating these things as like mathematical, and you say you're just making up numbers. Yeah, but the important thing to remember is that the defense attorney is essentially just making up numbers when they say you must acquit, right? They're saying it's 0. There's a reasoning going on there, and then an attempt to sort of not give any sort of assessment of uncertainty, which would allow for some rational process to update and push in one direction or another. So a better way to handle that is not to say, treat these numbers as the right numbers, but to elicit some assortment of reasonable priors and assessments of likelihood, and perhaps show that in any case, they push in one direction or another. In this case, again, if jurors were sort of in this situation, kind of, roughly speaking, might say that if they wound up with 90% in favor of guilt versus innocence, you might argue that that there's some reasonable doubt there, right? And that would be perhaps fair, but we'd have a kind of a reasoning behind it where, at least in theory, additional evidence, damning evidence, could push us toward no reasonable doubt.